By the time Attila became king of the Huns, his reputation had spread far and wide. The Gothic historian Jordanes said,
"He terrified all mankind. He was a man born into the world to shake the nations. The power of his proud spirit appeared in the movement of his body. He was, indeed, a lover of war."
But it was not just through force of personality that he transformed the Hun forces into an army that could fight the Roman legions on equal terms. Attila built on the Huns' legendary qualities in battle. What they lacked in armour and resources, they made up for by being versatile and nimble riders.
The Huns were nomad horsemen, and nomad horsemen from the Asian steppe were always seen as having a great military advantage. Not only that, but the Huns were particularly ferocious and were able even to beat their other nomad horse neighbours.
Attila's reorganisation relied on the Huns' traditional tribal system. Each tribe fielded an army of 10,000 warriors called a tumen. The basic unit of the tumen was 10 horsemen. 10 of these units formed a company. 10 companies comprised a squadron of 1,000, and 10 squadrons made up a tumen. A tumen commander ranked only one level below the king.
The nomad horsemen fought as they lived. They lived on the steppe. Their existence was from hunting and pastoral activities. They were used to movement, rapid movement on their many, many horses, and the bows that they used for attacking game and hunting could also be used very effectively for hunting human game in war.
Attila made sure the bow was the Huns' decisive weapon. Each warrior could shoot arrows accurately up to 100 meters away. The archers could nearly double that distance when they fired arrow showers at unspecific targets. Attila seldom committed his soldiers to close, sustained combat. He preferred to approach his enemy using the terrain as cover until he was within arrow range. One rank fired at a high angle to make the Romans raise their shields. Then another rank fired horizontally, straight into the enemy lines. Only then, when there was enough confusion, did Attila send his men in close to finish off the survivors. They had with them lassos and nets to drag their opponents from their battle lines. It was a strategy openly admired by the Roman historian Ammianus.
They fill the air with varied and discordant cries. But by being extremely swift and sudden in their movements, they pillage their enemy almost before he has become aware of their presence. They are the most terrible of warriors.
Attila also built up a network of spies and informers to gather intelligence about his enemies. On top of this, Attila developed a personality cult based on brutality and terror to inspire fear in his enemies and respect from his own troops. Rather like King Arthur, he was supposed to have found a sword half buried in the ground, the very sword once carried by Mars, the god of war. It apparently meant no other ruler could look the king of the Huns directly in the eyes without flinching.
I think the legend of the Sword of Mars gives us some kind of access to the kind of self-presentation that Attila wanted to generate about himself. What it says is this is a war leader chosen by God who throughout his life is simply going to beat every opponent he ever meets.
Bolstered by his brutal image and years of Roman tribute money, Attila presided over the vast Hun Empire of subject tribes. though it was never an empire on the Roman model.
Attila's domains were largely held together by threats of force and violence. Unlike the Roman Empire, Attila's empire was fragile. It had no administration, no infrastructure. In many ways, Attila was much closer to a modern drugs baron than he ever was to a Roman emperor.
I think Attila's empire was a more naked protection racket than most. Other barbarian peoples were regarded by the Huns in some ways virtually as slaves, but they also were made to fight with the Huns, which on the one hand gave the Huns a massive army, which they required in order to take on powers like the Roman Empire, but it also meant a degree of internal weakness. There's always the threat of rebellion.
The Huns were particularly threatening to the Romans because of all the barbarian tribes. They most steadfastly refused to Romanize. They refused to settle down and till the fields. They refused to learn Latin. They refused to convert to Christianity. Despite all the obvious advantages of Roman civilization, the Huns belligerently insisted on remaining nomadic raiders.
The Romans, as the Greeks before them, had run their empire from cities, the fount of all economic and political power. In the cruder Hun view, cities were for sacking and looting.
What the Huns were looking for, in common with most of the nomad peoples, is somebody to lead them in successful raiding. They wanted plunder, they wanted the good things in life, they had enough of hardship on the steppe, they wanted someone who could give them plunder and gold.
The Hunnic Empire always has to be at war because it consists not only of Huns but also subjected, dominated, largely Germanic-speaking tribes. People didn't vote to join the Hunnic Empire. They joined because they were conquered and intimidated into doing so. And they're kept there only by the extent to which Attila is handing out goods and or beating them up on a regular basis. You simply have to keep these people occupied every summer, trundling them out to go and fight somewhere else. Or they'll start fighting among themselves, or they'll start fighting you for independence.
So when the Roman emperor in Constantinople refused once again to pay the annual tribute, Attila unleashed his forces in a full-scale invasion. From their capital in Hungary, the Huns swept southeastward through what is now Romania, Bulgaria and Serbia. In his sights was the imperial stronghold of Constantinople itself. A Christian writer called Callinicus gave a contemporary account of Attila's men rampaging through Thrace on their way to the capital.
There was so much killing and bloodletting that no one could number the dead. The Huns pillaged the churches and monasteries and slew the monks and women. They so devastated Thrace that it will never rise again and be as it was before.
But just as Attila was in reach of Constantinople and licking his lips over the Roman imperial treasury, he was stopped in his tracks. Malaria and dysentery broke out in his army, and he had to limp home. Christians in the imperial capital believed they'd been saved from the heathen by divine intervention. When Attila was back in his palace in Hungary, Constantinople sent a high-ranking delegation to negotiate a peace treaty. It's a remarkable moment because it gives us an unparalleled insight into Attila the man. One of the Roman envoys was a senior politician called Priscus. He kept a diary of his visit, and so we have an extraordinary and unique account of what Attila was like in private. It's a very different picture from the public image of the ferocious barbarian which he'd so carefully cultivated. Attila laid on a banquet for his Roman visitors. Priscus was amazed that the ogre he'd expected to meet was actually a quiet, humble man. He wasn't ostentatious, even though he was clearly very wealthy. He lived in clean but very plain quarters.
In everything, he showed himself temperate. His cup was made of wood, while the guests were given goblets of gold and silver. His dress, too, was quite simple and clean. The sword at his side, the latchets of his shoes, and the bridle of his horse were not adorned.
What's striking, I think, from Priscus's envoy to the Hun court and his face-to-face observation of Attila is that he's not corroborating this idea of a genocidal barbarian. I think Priscus shows through his portrait of Attila himself that this is a man to be, in some sense, respected, certainly feared, but also respected.
Priscus's account of Attila is extremely valuable. It's rare in ancient history that we have such a precious and detailed eyewitness account. Through Priscus's eyes, we can see something of Hun society, and most importantly, we can experience something of the real Attila.
Attila and the Romans signed a treaty. Perhaps to Constantinople's surprise, Attila seemed ready for peace. At that stage, they didn't realize he had other fish to fry.
He'd already decided to go west and take his armies into Gaul. And Attila knew one of the great rules of European warfare, that a good general, as far as possible, should avoid fighting at the same time on an eastern and a western front.
Attila was sizing up the far richer pickings to be had in the Western Empire. But it was a sign of how big a player he'd become that he decided this time to have a political strategy instead of his smash-and-grab campaigns. He now wanted to challenge the emperor of the Western Roman Empire on equal terms. And in an extraordinary twist, the emperor's sister gave him the card he needed to play. The lady in question was called Honoria, and she was the subject of a sex scandal. She'd been caught in flagranti with her steward and was accused of bringing disgrace on the imperial family. The unfortunate steward was executed and Honoria was arrested. But in an astonishing piece of treachery, she took off her ring and managed to smuggle it to the Romans' greatest enemy, Attila. With it went a message: "Will you be my champion?"
Honoria's ring was just a brilliant excuse for war. It was perfect. Couldn't have asked for a better pretext. Attila had basically ransacked the entire Balkans. There wasn't anything else left to steal from the Eastern Empire. He was going to have to go west. He couldn't keep his empire at rest. So any pretext and anything that might sow dissension in the ranks of the political ranks of the Western Empire, that was just a godsend.
Attila sent a message back to the emperor. He was treating the gift of the ring as a marriage proposal from Honoria. And he demanded a dowry, half the territory of the Western Roman Empire. Attila was challenging the authority of the emperor. He was in deadly earnest, and the emperor knew it.
The relationship with Honoria also allowed Attila to present his attacks on the Roman Empire not as barbarian raids, but as part of a legally valid and legitimate claim. A claim by a husband for his wife's dowry, and a claim by Honoria to her legitimate imperial inheritance, which Attila reckoned to be worth at least half the Western Roman Empire.
The Western Emperor rejected Attila's demands and decided what his sister Honoria needed was a life of chastity and obedience, so he bundled her off to a nunnery in Constantinople. Attila declared war on Rome. The winner of this conflict would decide the fate of Western civilization.